The column stretched 4 miles across the frozen German landscape like a wounded snake crawling toward death. And in the middle of that column, a young, black woman named Rosetta Mae Jenkins put one foot in front of the other because stopping meant dying. And she had not survived 8 months in a Nazi prison camp, just to freeze to death on a road that led to nowhere. And with every step she took, she whispered the names of the people she loved, her mother and her father and her little sister, Annie, and she promised them that she would come home no matter what it cost her. She had been born in 1923 in a shotgun house in rural Mississippi, where the cotton fields stretched to the horizon and the summer heat pressed down like a physical weight. And her family had been sharecroppers working land that had been worked by their ancestors as slaves. And Rosetta had grown up knowing that the only way out of that endless cycle of poverty was education, and so she had studied by lamplight after long days in the fields, and she'd read every book she could get her hands on, and she had dreamed of a life beyond the boundaries that segregation had drawn around her. The escape from Mississippi came in 1941 when Rosetta Essent, who worked as a domestic servant in Chicago, sent word that there were jobs in the city for young women who were willing to work hard, and Rosetta packed everything she owned into a cardboard suitcase and boarded a northbound train. And she watched the cotton fields give way to cities and factories, and a world she had only imagined in her dreams. But what happened next changed everything, because in Chicago, Rosetta found work in a hospital as an orderly, and she discovered that she had a gift for caring for the sick and wounded. And when the Army announced that it was recruiting black women for the Women's Army Corps, she saw her chance to use that gift in service of something larger than herself. And in 1943 she enlisted and was sent to Fort Des Moines for training. The training was difficult, and the racism was constant, but Rosetta had grown up in Mississippi, where racism was woven into every aspect of daily life, and she knew how to endure indignities without letting them break her spirit. And she graduated near the top of her class, and was assigned to a medical support unit that would eventually be deployed to the European theater of operations. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because in the spring of 1944 Rosetta shipped out for England, where she spent months training for the invasion that everyone knew was coming. And in August she was sent to France to help staff a field hospital that would treat the wounded from the push toward Germany. And she worked 18-hour shifts, amputating limbs and stitching wounds and holding the hands of dying soldiers who called her Mama in their final moments. The hospital was set up in a converted chateau behind the front lines. But as the Allied advance pushed deeper into enemy territory, the front lines became fluid and unpredictable, and what had been safe territory could become a war zone overnight. And Rosetta learned to sleep with her boots on and her kit packed and ready, because evacuation orders could come at any moment. And then something no one expected, because in December of 1944, the Germans launched their last great offensive through the Ardennes. And suddenly the careful plans of the Allied command were thrown into chaos, and units that had been safely behind the lines found themselves in the path of German panzer divisions. And Rosetta's hospital was overrun before anyone had time to evacuate. The capture happened so fast that Rosetta barely had time to understand what was happening. In one moment she was changing bandages, and the next moment there were German soldiers everywhere shouting orders in a language she did not understand and pointing their rifles at the American medical staff and patients alike. And she raised her hands and prayed that this was not the end. Behind these ruins a secret waited, because Rosetta was not immediately killed despite being both black and female. And instead she was herded with the other captured medical personnel into the back of a truck and driven east toward Germany. And she would later learn that the Germans were so short of medical workers that they were willing to use even captured Americans to tend to their own wounded. The journey to the prison camp took 3 days, and Rosetta rode in the back of an open truck through December snow with 20 other American prisoners, including 4 nurses and several medics, and they huddled together for warmth and shared what little food the Germans gave them. And Rosetta watched the German countryside pass by and wondered if she would ever see America again. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because the camp where Rosetta was taken was not a typical POW facility, but a medical labor camp where captured Allied personnel were put to work in a German military hospital treating wounded soldiers, and the conditions were brutal, with 16-hour shifts and barely enough food to survive, but at least the work kept them inside during the worst of the winter cold. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because Rosetta's medical training made her valuable and she was assigned to work in the surgical ward where she assisted German doctors in operations that often lasted 4 hours, and she treated German soldiers who had been trying to kill her countrymen just days before, and she found that she could not hate them because they were just wounded men crying for their mothers like all wounded men everywhere. The winter of 1944 to 45 was one of the coldest on record in Europe, and the camp where Rosetta was held had almost no heat, and the prisoners survived by huddling together at night, and by the calories they burned during their endless work shifts in every week. Prisoners died from exhaustion or disease, or the casual cruelty of guards who saw them as less than human. But what happened next changed everything, because in late January, as the Soviet army approached from the east, Germans decided to evacuate the camp and move the prisoners west away from the advancing Russians. And this evacuation would become known as one of the death marches that killed tens of thousands of prisoners in the final months of the war. The march began on January 27th at 4 in the morning when the temperature was 15 degrees below zero, and the guards roused the prisoners from their bunks and gave them 10 minutes to gather whatever they could carry and then marched them out into the frozen darkness, with no destination announced and no end in sight. And then something no one expected, because Rosetta had prepared for this moment without even knowing she was preparing. And during her months in the camp, she had secretly saved scraps of food and had made herself a pair of mittens from surgical bandages, and had wrapped her feet in extra layers of cloth, and these small preparations would prove to be the difference between life and death. The first day of the march covered 18 miles through snow that was sometimes knee-deep, and prisoners who fell were shot or left to freeze in Rosetta watched people she had worked beside for months collapse and die within feet of her, and she kept walking because stopping was not an option, and because somewhere deep inside her was a stubborn refusal to let the Nazis win. Behind these ruins a secret waited, because Rosetta discovered that she had reserves of strength she had never known existed, and the same determination that had carried her from the cotton fields of Mississippi to the hospitals of Chicago to the battlefields of Europe now carried her through the frozen hell of the death march, and she began to help others who were weaker than herself. The days blurred together in a haze of cold and hunger and exhaustion as the column trudged west through a Germany that was being destroyed by Allied bombing, and sometimes they passed through towns where the buildings were still smoking from air raids, and sometimes they slept in barns or in the open fields. And always the guards pushed them forward toward a destination that no one knew. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because on the 5th day of the march, Rosetta realized that she had become the de facto leader of a small group of women prisoners who had clustered around her for protection, and she organized them into a unit that shared food and warmth and took turns breaking trail through the deep snow, and this organization saved lives that would have been lost without it. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because the march continued for 47 days through some of the worst winter weather in European history, and Rosetta watched more than half of the prisoners who had started the march die along the way, and she kept a mental list of their names, because she promised herself that if she survived, she would tell their families what had happened to them. The guards themselves were suffering, and some of them began to die from the same cold and hunger that was killing the prisoners, and as the days passed, the guards became less vigilant, and some prisoners managed to escape, but Rosetta stayed with her group because she would not abandon the women who depended on her, and because she believed that survival was more likely if they stuck together. And then something no one expected, because on the 32nd day of the march, the column was attacked by American fighter planes that had mistaken them for German troops, and prisoners scattered into the ditches in the woods. And when the planes flew away, Rosetta found that she had become separated from the main column and was alone in a frozen forest with 6 other women. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of Rosetta's life, as she led her small group through enemy territory trying to find the American lines, and they survived on frozen vegetables dug from abandoned gardens, and water from streams, and they slept in haystacks and abandoned buildings, and they hid from German patrols that would have killed them on sight. But what happened next changed everything, because on March 15th, 1945, Rosetta and her group stumbled out of a forest and found themselves looking at an American checkpoint, and she raised her hands and shouted that they were American soldiers, and the young Gius, who approached them, could not believe what they were seeing: 7 women in rags who had walked through hell to reach freedom. The reunion with American forces was overwhelming as Rosetta collapsed into the arms of the first American soldier she reached and wept for the first time since the march had begun. And the medics, who examined her, found that she had lost more than 40 pounds and had frostbite on both feet and was suffering from malnutrition and exposure, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. The debriefing took days, as intelligence officers questioned Rosetta about everything she had seen and experienced during her captivity in March. And she told them about the camp and the hospital and the death march and the names of everyone who had died, and she asked them to make sure the families were told what had happened to their loved ones. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because when the army recommended Rosetta for the Silver Star for her leadership during the death march, the recommendation was denied because the army did not believe that a black woman could have done what she had done, and instead she was given a bronze star and a letter of commendation and sent home to recover. The recovery took months in a military hospital in Pennsylvania where doctors worked to heal her frostbitten feet and her malnourished body, and the nurses said she cried out in her sleep every night, reliving the march and the cold and the deaths of her friends, and she wondered if she would ever be whole again. The decades that followed were marked by quiet perseverance as Rosetta used her bill benefits to complete her nursing degree and became one of the first black registered nurses in her county, and she worked in hospitals for 40 years. And she raised a family, and she rarely spoke about what had happened during the war because the memories were too painful and because no one seemed to want to hear the stories of black women who had served. The recognition came late, as it so often does, when in 2018 a historian researching death marches discovered Rosetta's records and realized that her story had never been properly told, and he spent 2 years documenting her service and advocating for proper recognition. And finally, in 2020, at a ceremony at the Pentagon, Rosetta Mae Jenkins received the Silver Star that had been denied to her 75 years earlier. She was 96 years old, and she sat in her wheelchair with tears streaming down her face as the Secretary of the Army pinned the medal to her chest, and she said that she did not deserve any special recognition because she had only done what anyone would do to survive. But the Secretary said that was exactly why she deserved it, because she had not just survived, she had helped others survive too. And today, if you visit the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, you will find an exhibit dedicated to the death march, including photographs of Rosetta Jenkins and the names of the women she saved, and her story stands as a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. Because the truth is that the death marches of 1945 were among the greatest atrocities of the entire war, and tens of thousands of prisoners died in those frozen columns. And the fact that anyone survived at all is a miracle, and Rosetta Jenkins was part of that miracle. Her story reminds us that survival is not just about physical strength, but about the will to keep going when everything inside you wants to stop, and about the power of community and mutual aid, and about the stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up seems like the only rational choice. So the next time you face an obstacle that seems insurmountable, remember Rosetta Jenkins. Remember the young woman from Mississippi who walked through 47 days of frozen hell and came out the other side. And ask yourself what she would do in your situation. And somewhere beyond the veil, Rosetta Mae Jenkins is finally at rest, knowing that her story has been told, and that the women she carried through the snow have been remembered, and that her journey from the cotton fields of Mississippi to the death marshes of Germany and back home again has finally been honored. Her grave in Mississippi is marked with a simple headstone that bears her name and her dates, and the words, "She walked through the valley," and visitors still come to pay their respects to the woman who proved that the human spirit cannot be frozen, even by the coldest winter in history. Because in the end, Rosetta Jenkins did not just survive the death march, she transcended it, and she spent the rest of her life showing others that they too could survive whatever trials they faced, and that is the kind of victory that echoes through eternity.